Our next presenters are Carroll Golden, Executive Director of the Centers of Excellence at NAIFA, and Maeghan Gale, Policy Director on the Government Relations team at NAIFA, with Don't Be Left in the Dark, the scary truth about America's long-term care needs. Take it away.
Thank you, Zach. I think we can go to our first slide. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you who are attending. And we hope very much that if you have questions or you need further clarification, Maeghan and I are available. Maeghan and I both run the Legislative Working Group as part of the Limited and Extended Care Planning Center. We have regular calls depending on what's happening in the states. In other words, we talk about the Washington Cares, we talk about the California Trust, but we also review other states, as you will see. So I'd like to thank Maeghan, of course, for taking her time and energy and putting all of this together, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome everyone. We're so glad that you were able to join us. Like Zach said, I serve as NAIFA's Public Policy Director and work very closely with Carol through the process. And looking forward to talking to you guys today about the scary state of long-term care.
Zach, next slide. All right, so most of us know that, and we've heard so many times that 10,000 baby boomers are turning 65 each year, and that many of them will need some level of care, and that only about 7% actually own private long-term care. These are very disturbing and frankly, unfortunate statistics, because when we look at the cost of care, it's only increasing, and it's increasing dramatically, especially in places like home care. The homemaker for home care has gone up in 1 year, 20 to 21, more than 10%. And when it comes to a home care aide, that's gone up between 2020 and 2021, more than 12%. And we don't see that stopping. So to say that it can quickly exhaust personal funds is true, and especially because, as our previous speaker, Steve Kane, said, you need to relate this actually to what this person is seeing in the news. Remember, he mentioned that Regency is the biggest influencer in the way people make decisions. And certainly they're seeing a lot about it in the news. We also know statistically that most care is being handled still by family members. And remembering that some of that is cultural, but some of it is also going to really impact the fact that we have 4 generations, all of whom are at the work site now. And somebody is going to have to handle the care, whether it's going to be full-time, part-time. We're going to see that the states certainly now have recognized that we are in a public health crisis. Next. And we know that the private coverage gap is growing. Now, hopefully, we will see, as a result of some very serious consideration being given by certain states, and that being in the news, and our getting very educated about what is happening in those states, we will see a reversal of this graft. But that's going to take you understanding why today, for example, we have such varied presentations. But Maeghan and I are going to really focus today on what is the current situation with advocacy. And we certainly know that with the midterm elections coming up, we could hear much more about it. Next. So what is the situation? Well, obviously, The US has spent over 400 billion on long-term care services and supports. And in 2020, nearly 10% of all the national healthcare expenditures involved LTSS. What is this telling us? Well, obviously that we need to pay a lot more attention about what's happening to states and their budgets, and what are they going to take as an approach towards fixing this problem. If we see the chart on the right indicating to us that private insurance is substantially less than what Medicaid is paying out. And on the public and private, you can see it's already up to 62 billion. And where is the healthcare being done? Well, it doesn't really matter where it's being done. The fact is, most people want it to be done at home. Now, that means that depends on how they actually define home. But we never heard anybody say, I want to be taken out of my home and taken somewhere else for care. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maeghan. Maeghan?
Oh, yes. On the state side, this is a very important consideration, particularly when we find that, the states are required often to run balanced budgets. And unlike the federal government, they're not able to kind of borrow and spend ahead and kind of figure out how to pay for it later. It is a real-time expense for many of these states. And so I think it's part of why we really are seeing things step up in terms of legislatively and in terms of, different types of approaches needing to be taken. And Carol, I think you have spent so much time speaking on and writing books on how caregivers are impacted here. So I will leave this one to you.
Well, the fact is, almost all of your clients either are a caregiver or they're going to need caregiving. So either they're the recipient or they're going to be giving it. And for that reason, this is a real opportunity. Now, if you're not using a statistic, for some clients, if you have a CPA, you might have to talk a little bit about the statistics that you just saw about where the money is coming from and where it's going to. But if you're talking to a middle America client of yours, their concern is, well, if I become a caregiver, what's going to happen to what's happening to me? 60% are employed. And we all realize that if you have to be taken away from doing your job because, one, you're distracted being a caregiver, two, there is the physical aspects of being a caregiver, and then three, there is the family that expect that of you. Financially, it could have an impact. So we know that they spend over $7,000 on out-of-pocket expenses. Where does that come from? And wherever it's coming from, it isn't going where they would have hoped that it goes. We often talk in the industry about sandwich generation, but you need to think about that. Picture yourself if tomorrow you had to suddenly be thrown into being a caregiver. What exactly would that mean to the person that you're taking care of? What would that mean to the rest of your family, to your job? It's a complicated position, and frankly, we're not trained for that. Or flip it. Think about if you are a person who is starting to become aware that you may be a care recipient. Are you prepared? Do you want to interrupt somebody else's life? Do you want to lose your ability to have your wishes known on what you want? So let's face it, You can approach this with storytelling. You can approach it from a financial point of view. Even doing an insurance review gives you an opportunity to say, you know, I can see that you're a person who offsets risks. Have you offset any kind of healthcare risks for when you may need more than just casual care? There's lots of ways. Wait for the answer. See what they say. Next.
All right, so when we talk about public-private partnerships, I understand this is a relatively new concept to the space. So many of you, whether you be producers or have other roles within the industry, may not be 100% familiar with this concept. So what I hope to do here is to kind of talk you through some of these basic terms and these basic plan types that we are starting to see, and really form the foundation of what public programs could look like moving forward, and kind of the decisions that have to be made, and how a public-private partnership is going to be formed, and kind of how either states or federally they will approach it. There are three core public long-term care insurance plan types. We have front-end programs. So these are those benefits that are payable at or near the beginning of eligibility. That does not mean there has to be zero elimination period, but it also often means that elimination period would be either non-existent or very, very small. Like we have seen in Washington, it tends to be potentially less than 30, around that 30-day mark. The pros of these front-end programs is that typically everyone who qualifies for and needs this LTSS benefit would receive it. They are less costly than this back-end or comprehensive alternative that we'll talk about. They are more predictable costs because it is typically set in this set amount of benefits, whether that is a monthly or annual, and there's almost always a set maximized benefit. What we'll see in Washington is that is about $36,500. So this more predictable cost means it's less likely to overlap with Medicaid than typically with back-end or comprehensive coverage, but it's much easier to price as well. The con of this is that it does typically pays less per claim than the alternatives. The benefits are likely insufficient to cover most long-term care costs. Median costs are, over $100,000, with that 75th percentile being well over $250,000 in claim costs. So you can see something of 36,500 would be, very, very insufficient. And individuals who need LTSS expenditures will likely exceed the public benefit and still be facing some of that spend down for any remaining costs before qualifying for Medicaid. But when we look at back-end programs, so these are programs that benefits are payable after the individual has been impaired for a much longer period of time. So we would see some of the proposals here that period of time is somewhere from 1 year to 5 years. And so that you have this large chunk that is not going to be covered. However, on the back-end side, there isn't typically a set endpoint. So you often will see this referred to as catastrophic coverage, which certainly has its pros and cons as well. So generally it does pay more than front-end coverage with that longer max duration. It does help with those extremely high claim cost situations. And it is more likely to reduce state spending on Medicaid. And it is easier for the private market to design a supplemental front-end coverage. That front-end risk of liability we know is easier to price and predict. So you end up with a situation where you would have a much more of like a gap type private coverage with a public catastrophic back-end coverage for needs. The cons here is that it is more expensive than front end. It helps fewer people because there's a certain amount that will not ever make it through that extended impairment period. There could be significant overlap with Medicaid and potentially a loss of federal Medicaid contributions. And many may still become impoverished during the waiting periods and of course, unpredictable cost. When we look at comprehensive coverage, we see these much more internationally. And the pro here is that everyone who qualifies and needs LTSS coverage would receive a benefit. Cost control abilities to negotiate or regulate prices and services are often included in these programs. And it has a potentially lower administrative cost because you're not deciding who qualifies for coverage at which point. The cons here is the total cost of the program. They, when you're talking about this level of benefits, they are rather high. Politically, they are typically unpopular, particularly within the American system. And the program costs are just very unpredictable. It is difficult to appropriately price this. But one note about comprehensive coverage is that we should not assume that they are total coverage options. So if we take a closer look at some of the international programs, you'll find that private insurance still plays a significant role. Most have lower benefit amounts, but without this time duration limitations. For example, in the French program, it only covers about a third of expected expenses on a monthly basis. And private insurance programs are usually supplement this public benefit. So hopefully that gives you guys a good foundation there, those types of coverage. When we look at plan structures, we see this public, private, and hybrid. So under public, you'll see programs like universal social insurance. You'll see things like vested social insurance, which we are familiar with in terms of Social Security, and targeted public assistance, which we are familiar with in some of the other needs-based entitlement programs. And then on the private side, you know, we look for more private solutions and risk sharing of long-term care. So this would be a scenario where potentially, you know, there would be a private avenue for coverage, but would be subsidized by, you know, public funds, whether to buy down risk or risk sharing of some sort. And then this hybrid is where a public benefit is designed to exist alongside with private insurance products. And then, well, just to, you know, a lot of this in this conversation really stems from the fact that we have seen, you know, Washington State, you know, pass legislation and subsequently almost enact a program. It was delayed 18 months, but it is a first of its kind, and as any kind of groundbreaking program, it has had its trials and tribulations, and there has been lots of lessons learned along the way. But this is a universal front-end long-term care insurance program. It is based on an earned benefit, so only those who contribute are eligible, and it has a typical vesting period of 10 years with some slight variations for those who are near retirement, in early retirement. And it is likely going to, this is a mid-program change where they're going to likely vest in like in a step investing. So they may not be eligible for full benefits, but at least they would be eligible for some benefits if they are contributing for a set number of years. It is self-funded from a worker payroll deduction. That is no employer contributions and no wage gap. Right now it is set at 0.58% of wages. And it will have a lifetime maximum benefit of $36,500. And that is set on a unit cost. And the idea there is that it is essentially $100 a day for a year is kind of where that calculation came from. Contributions were set to begin earlier this year in April, and that was legislatively, it was pushed forward 18 months. So contributions are now set to take place on 7/1/2023, with benefits being eligible to be collected in 2026. Like I said, we have learned a lot of lessons. Our legislative working group has spent a lot of time just really poring over each of these different elements within the Washington Cares program, deciding what we felt has worked, what we felt hasn't. And this has really kind of started to develop what we feel is an appropriate program to move forward. But, if we could go to the next slide. I think it's important to note that, there are discussions on a federal level as well. The WISH Act, while it is currently not a viable legislation, we are seeing discussions around this topic at the federal level, and the proposal put forth is a federal catastrophic long-term care insurance program with that back-end coverage we discussed earlier. So this program's cash benefit, it's equal to a median cost of a 6-hour per day personal care. Is it how they're coming up with that calculation versus that $100 a day? And which is significantly higher at, an estimated $3,600 a month. This has a 1 to 5 year elimination period based on average income. So those lower earners would maybe be looking at only a 1 year need to cover their own costs, but those really high end earners would be looking at nearly a 5 years, and then a full sliding scale between that. So this, though, is proposed to be funded as a shared employer-employee payroll tax, notably not much higher than what we saw in Washington. So, a little bit different. You can kind of see how maybe a similar tax, could be structured in different way to provide different types of benefits. And I think we can move forward. So on the state legislative trends, with what we saw in Washington, we know that there are going to be more states follow suit. We have seen, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. You can say we have seen public study options in a number of states, including California, has been running their legislative task force for their long-term care task force for about a year, and are set to produce a final report at the end of December. Public option studies have been seen in South Dakota, Minnesota, Michigan, Vermont, and we have seen legislation proposed throughout the years in Maine, New York, and Pennsylvania. Both have actually current legislation that is sitting technically active, though we know that their sessions are getting ready to end and they don't have the political viability to move forward. But we do have, an interesting program that was enacted in Hawaii. It is very different than the two other programs we spoke, and does focus more on the caregivers as opposed to the care receivers. But you can see, this states are concerned, and they are looking at it each in their own individual and regionally specific way. And I think that's, we're really going to start seeing more states look to Washington's program if it is able to, fully kick off the ground, and look to emulate it. So we are preparing for this map to be much, much busier in the coming legislative season. But not to say that it wasn't slow last year. We were tracking over 61 bills throughout the legislative season. And you can see that in that, right after the early 2022, December 2021, we really saw a big spike of this. And as we, get to the other side of the midterms, we know that we are going to see this type of spike again, if not significantly exaggerated. Last session, we did have a lot of states that are on this kind of short session, long session, that are going to be coming into their long session. So again, we are gearing up for a much heavier legislative season on this term, given all the factors we've kind of discussed so far. And then it's not just these public programs and public study programs, but also a lot of the other factors around long-term care insurance legislation we'll be looking at, including rate regulation, encouraging partnership programs. There's a lot of discussions around, record keeping, notifications, rate changes, transparency, And then looking for, other ways, tax incentives and tax credits to, help encourage more people to take up, private long-term care coverage or offset some of those unpaid care costs to, different ways to encourage people to, hopefully stay in their home. And then finally, I think to point out that when we talk about public programs, a lot of times we start to think, public programs tend to be much more of a Democrat heavy, type of issue. But here we really do see that this, while it is heavier on the Democratic side, this is very bipartisan. We see, quite a bit of bills come through sponsored, Republicans and Democrats. And when we have bipartisan recognition of the significance of long-term care issues, I think that we see that increased likelihood of viability as legislation comes through. So, this certainly is not a red issue or a blue issue. This is an all issue. All right, Carol.
Okay. I do want to mention that, Washington has had a lot of challenges. We give it tremendous credit for recognizing how important planning for extended or long-term care is. Now, in our legislative working group, we have spent quite a bit of time talking about some of the committees that were formed because, frankly, I think the states have now realized that if we only have somewhere around 7% private long-term care in the marketplace, it's because it's a very difficult program to put together and to get people to recognize how important it is. The 4 areas that the Washington Cares is looking at that I think is going to be significant. Now, we know that Pennsylvania and New York just took the WACARES and plunked it down into, well, this is what we would do. I guess it was just a gesture, but the fact is WACARES is now looking at benefit eligibility. You can imagine with Google and Microsoft being in the state of Washington, that people who are working remotely, how do they, if they have to pay in, as Maeghan indicated, from their W-2 with no cap and including bonuses and commissions, how do they get the benefit out since you must be a state resident? Some of the other important committees that were of interest to the distribution was, are they going to line up the benefit eligibility triggers with the HIPAA, which is so prevalent in, well, in order to have a qualified product, it's dictated, the benefit triggers by HIPAA. So when you're looking at that, up comes the idea of WACARES having supplemental policies, because as someone in the chat said, $36,500 probably won't go very far, or at least if you're really looking for it to provide most of the coverage. So now that's being heavily discussed, and something that influenced the carriers and the distributors was recertification. My point is this: in Washington, most agents recognized that, was it a perfect program? Almost a perfect storm for some, where they were overwhelmed with the amount of work that came in such a short period of time to make the opt-out program work. Many of us on the legislative working group are now discussing, do we feel that California will have a set opt-out time? Looking at the options, we don't see that. So we know that people, meaning when you're going to be taking money out of their paycheck, we at least feel that they should be able to know their options. know whether the public policy or the private policy or a combination of the two is best for them. So we're talking about now how to work best with states so that their programs are fiscally responsible, but the focus for most of us is that the customer, the individual, wind up with what is best for their own situation. And for most of us who are participating in this legislative working group that Maeghan and I are in charge of at the LECP Center, we are always looking for feedback. And fortunately for us, having a mix of carriers, BGAs, individuals, agents who are not long-term care specialists, but who recognize that as this gets more and more into the news, again, as Steve Kane just told us in the last session, people are very influenced by social media and by the news. So we just want to make sure that we're well prepared. NAIFA is doing everything they can to collect and to discuss important issues. Next. So here's some of, Maeghan, would you like to take this or do you want me to continue?
Well, this has been, this slide is such a product of our joint effort. So we thought it'd be good to kind of give you guys a bit of thoughts of, where our legislative working group has kind of come down through many discussions on, what we feel would be some good parameters for public long-term care programs. And this is still an ongoing discussion, and I think it's important to say that we do recognize that neither the public sector nor the private sector is fully equipped to handle this alone, and that this public-private partnership really truly is likely the best path forward. But of course, the devil is in the details and in the execution. And so we feel that, any program that comes forth should absolutely, be less than 1% of income, be based on those HIPAA standard ADLs, as Carroll was saying, absolutely provide exemptions for those who would never be able to collect benefits. While this may seem obvious, it very much was a situation, multiple situations that did arise because of the broad kind of brush strokes that the Washington Cares program originally put forward. So there has been some updates to exclude groups like temporary work visa holders who, are not working long-term, people who live cross states. If someone lived in Oregon, but, drove across the border to work in Washington, they were in a position to have to pay but never collect. Those who receive military benefits that significantly duplicate this, again, we're kind of in a situation where they were going to be required to pay, but likely not able to collect. So we want to make sure that, those groups are protected here, and that those exemptions make sure that no one is paying for, paying a tax or something that they can't benefit from. We do feel strongly that providing that initial opt-out for private policyholders, is an important step. And, we saw that there are, and this is a tricky one. There really does need to be a balance here, because we saw in Washington that when, when told you have to have coverage, a very large number of people, nearly 500,000 decided that private coverage was the best solution forward. We know that some of those people were just selecting that to, get out of the tax, so to speak, but many we have heard, has started that proper planning conversation that probably should have been happening sooner. So we want to encourage those type of planning conversations and the opportunity to select the right type of choices. I also feel that eligible private coverage should be clearly defined and include a wide variety of options so that people can pick what fits best in their planning and their financial goals. This includes like long-term care, life riders, and maybe even broader than that. this was again a concern in Washington. No one was really clear what would qualify, what wouldn't, kind of leading up to that that closing of the opt-out window. And of course, coordinating for private coverage and incentives to elect private coverage in the future. Because this is one of our main considerations, as we're working with the California Legislative Working Group, and we are seeing, they are hearing us, and they do recognize that the private coverage is going to have a place there. And, as we think down the road of what that private coverage would look like, there's a whole another realm of, reducing regulations and creating a pathway for new and innovative products to, fill that space. So they are looking at options, including a reduction in premiums in the programs if you elect private coverage, and some other incentives along the way. So we feel like that's very important progress forward that we didn't see as much in Washington, that we are looking for down the road. Of course, requiring recertification of private policies. We want these to be sticky. We don't want agents having chargebacks. We feel like you should have to maintain that private coverage if you do use it as an opt-out. And then allowing for some level of portability. This is an increasingly global world, and the likelihood of people working their 10 years in a state and then being able to move in retirement, this would significantly limit that type of coverage if there wasn't some level of portability. So again, back to that, we don't want people to have to pay into a program to where they are not going to be able to benefit down the line. So those are kind of the core foundations that we're working towards as we have our advocacy efforts on these public programs.
I see that there is a question, Winnie, in chat said, is the coverage reciprocal if the beneficiary moved to different states? Well, I have heard the people at WACARES say that they're hopeful that at some point it will be reciprocal. But I think for those who are familiar with what it took for the partnership program to become part of the compact states and so on and so forth, I guess the answer, Winnie, is at the moment, it's not reciprocal because there's no other plan that is a duplicate or that have actually said, well, if they move here. Now, dealing with that, however, the state itself is looking at ways that if you left the state and you continued to pay in until a certain age, which is the retirement age, then you would qualify to get some of those benefits. It's a discussion, not a decision, by the way. And then there are other discussions of what do you do with a pre-retiree? I go back to the fact that Maeghan and I and this legislative working group have started to really look at so many issues. We'll move on to California. They have the advantage of having seen some of the issues that have come up in Washington state. And of course, we haven't gotten to discuss much about what is the claim adjudication for a program that goes in place. Most of what we're looking at is just forming the program, but then verification, claim adjudication, it really does show the states that this is a challenging subject. And the more that they turn to the industry, our industry, who has so much experience with creating programs, products, marketing, etc., the better off they would be and we would be. So the California task force has been working very hard and very steadily, and they will put their recommendations out in late December or early January. They do have 1 year, 2023, to look at the financial feasibility aspects of it. WACARES just came out with their second iteration, which was done by Millman, on what has changed, what updates there are. It's the feasibility is top of mind for most of what's happening, because remember, the objective is to get more people qualified for LTSS and long-term care and not wind up on Medicaid. So there is a strong financial orientation to all of this. For, as Maeghan has said before, and I quite agree, you can expect a wave of proposals in 2023 once we see how the midterm elections sort through and legislative is back in session. There, we feel, looking at the 5 options for the California program, that'll be more typical, feeling that if people want to opt out of a state program, if they know there's a state program, okay, but if they want to opt out, this is the time for them to be looking into long-term care.
And I see, Carol, Winnie had a question too about the Obama National Long-Term Care Insurance Program. And yes, that was, that never did kick off the ground. And I think that what we saw there and the lesson that we have seen the states really carry forward from that is that program was voluntary. And anytime we have a voluntary program, particularly with one with such high claim expenditures and high likelihood of claim, is that you have significant adverse selection. And given the cost parameters that were, permitted under that program and the adverse selection, the program was required to show that it was viable, and it was never able to do that. So it was never permitted to move forward. And so I think that's a big reason why we see states making every effort to make this mandatory and to opt out as few people as possible, really looking, because that adverse selection piece here is such a critical economic and feasibility factor.
But you'll notice also she asked about qualifying for Medicaid if they opt out of the state mandated program. That's one of the questions that our group is looking at, isn't it, Maeghan? Because if they exhaust the 36.5 and they have private care in place, but they have an elimination period, what happens with that little donut hole where they're off of the state program, but not on private long-term care? So good question, because actually it's a question they are grappling with as we speak.
Again, the devil is certainly in the details here, in understanding how, those transitions on and off. And in a state like California, you have not only federal Medicaid, but Medi-Cal and all these other additional programs that a public program would need also to coordinate with. Yes, and then of course, as Ray said, there are some states that have eliminated asset tests for Medicaid, but not all. And how is that going to look and play into eligibility along the way? So, I would say that for those of you out here, what might be your big takeaway from today is that the landscape of long-term care insurance is significantly changing. I think we are very much in the beginning, and things 5 years from now or likely look very different. But I would not expect that as public programs come forward, and we do truly expect that they will, at what speed is still to be determined, is that there will be little to no opt-out window. So as you're having those meetings and those planning sessions with your clients, it is there's more imperative than ever to include long-term care in that conversation.
Well, with that, if there are any other questions, if there's anything else that you would like to share or to ask, please don't hesitate to contact either myself or Maeghan. We would very much like to include you in our legislative working group, which, as I mentioned, is it's interesting. It's mostly dialogue because we have people who are in those states experiencing all this firsthand. We have actuaries and carriers who are able to give responses when we come up with, well, here's an answer but it actually might hurt the state program. What we would like best, of course, is to work closely with our state legislators. And our grassroots at NAIFA is strong. We also work with ACLI. We have relationships with the other associations that are concerned. But like Maeghan, I feel it's important for you to take away from this that now is your opportunity. Now you can be honest with people that while this is confined to one state that has actually passed legislation, other states have proposals, some of them have studies, some of them have caregiving programs like Hawaii and one other state. But the fact is, most people lack information and they are afraid. As Harlan in our first session said, maybe we should have called this instead of don't be scared of LTC. Maybe we should have called today, don't be scared of LTC planning. So please contact your clients, contact your business owners, think about the impact on investments, retirement. Whatever you do, we feel that this topic could certainly touch your client. So thank you for attending, and I turn this back to Zach.
Thanks so much, Carol. And as Carol said, thank you so much for sticking around for this session as well. We are going to give you about a 14-minute break here before we have our next presenter, Jeff Levin from One America. Thanks so much.